Getting invited to guest on a podcast can be exciting. It can also be nerve-wracking, but it's a great way of promoting your podcast or your business or simply speaking to people about the things you love. But how do you make sure that you're delivering real value to people and that you're making a good impression on your interview? In this video, I'm sharing 5 tips on how to prepare for your interviews as a guest. So if you're ready to level up your podcast guest appearances, then let's dive in. Number 1, research the podcast and the host. So before getting on an interview, make sure you take the time to have a listen to a few episodes and really understand what that podcast is about and who the ideal listener is most specifically. If, for example, you run a YouTube channel based around cooking and you've been invited to guest on a YouTube podcast, and the ideal listener for that podcast are YouTubers who tune in to get a better understanding of how to build and grow YouTube channels. So if you spend the whole time talking about cooking rather than the actual process of building the YouTube channel itself, then the listeners won't get any value. The host will probably be a bit disappointed and it probably won't be shared or get as much attention as it deserves, which in turn is going to affect whatever outcome you were hoping to achieve by guesting on that podcast. So this is something to get really clear on before getting on the interview and ideally before booking. And if you have a good host, then they should go through some of these things with you, but it's worth listening to a few episodes to get a real understanding. Number 2 is to know your host's interview style. So again, if you listen to a few episodes, you're going to get a good understanding of this, but also it might be worth asking the host, if they don't give you any already, for a couple of example questions. Some podcasts are more laid back, just a kind of back and forth flowing conversation. Others are more clearly planned and they have particular expectations of their guests. Some hosts tend to ask questions pretty quickly, so more rapid fire, whereas others expect a more kind of long and reflective response. And being prepared for the host interview style is going to help you to be more confident and relaxed during the interview. Number 3 is to prepare your message. So before you start the interview, consider the message that you really want to get across to people. So if we go back to tip number 1, when we talked about the ideal listener, what is the message that you want that ideal listener to come away from? And this shouldn't just be, I want to promote my business or my podcast. I want to get them to, interact with my content. Although that is good to have in mind, and we'll get onto that more in a little bit. But think value first, because if you're not offering value, then they won't be interested in following up with any of your content or your call to actions anyway. If you already have a lot of experience speaking, then this shouldn't be an issue, because the host probably invited you on because of that, because of a particular message that you tend to share. But if you don't have a huge amount of experience, then just practice going through some of your key points, the main things that you want to hit on. And it doesn't mean memorizing a script. You can just write a few points and maybe practice speaking to friends and family beforehand. And it can be quite helpful to structure things in 3s, so like a film, like a beginning, a middle, and an end. For example, if we think about the cooking YouTuber again, what are the 3 takeaways that they want to share with the audience? It could be number 1, how to come up with a channel idea that aligns with your values and that meets a demand on YouTube. Number 2, it could be how to stay consistent with content creation and some of the maybe 1 or 2 examples of specific challenges that you've faced and how you've overcome them. It's good to have these real stories in your back pocket that offer value. And finally, it could be how to connect with your audience. And again, some specific examples of the benefits you've gotten from connecting with your audience and the benefits that your audience have gotten from you. So this is obviously just one example. Have a think about how you can structure your message to bring the most value. And then finally, you're going to want to think about what call to action or CTA that you want to give the listeners at the end. Because again, if you have a good host, they'll ask you what you want to share or what you want to promote at the end. And this should be one single, simple call to action. For example, visiting your website, subscribing to your podcast or YouTube channel, or following you on a specific social media platform, your biggest one. You hear a lot of podcasts where the guest will start reeling off all these different things that the listener can do. Search me on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram and subscribe to my YouTube channel and my podcast, and you can visit our website and get this freebie. And it's so much that the listener's not going to know which one to do, and often they're just going to decide, and often they're just going to leave it. But if you've got this one specific call to action, ideally one that's going to offer them some value, then the listener is much more likely to take action. Number 4 is prepare your setup. This one is often overlooked, but it's really important if you want to give the host something they'll be proud to share. So make sure you're recording in a quiet, distraction-free space, also with good lighting if it's a video podcast. Test your microphone and internet connection beforehand. You don't want to be figuring out those issues during the call, during that slot that you've booked. Make sure that you're wearing headphones or earphones. And if you are wearing earphones, then make sure they're not too loud. Because if you're using speakers or really loud earphones, the sound that you're listening to, so the host speaking, can go back into the microphone and it creates this horrible kind of echoey effect that can be hard to edit, and it ends up making the end result a lot worse. And also make sure that you have a drink nearby. And if you have to pause or collect your thoughts or something, then just say, because you don't have to be perfect. If it's a good podcast, it'll be edited. Your host, I'm sure, will allow you to take a minute. Sometimes when I'm listening to a podcast, especially one that I'm editing, you can tell the guest really doesn't want to stop or interrupt. So they'll be doing things like clearing their throat while they're talking so that they don't have to pause and, say, sorry, I need to take a drink. And then what you get is this kind of half coughing, half word that's really difficult to edit, and it just ends up making the result worse. So just take a break if you need to. So make sure you're prepared, but also know that you can take a break if you need to. And finally, help promote your episode. Find out what the release date is, if there is one, so that you can share with your audience on social media or in your newsletter if you have one. Not only does this help the podcast reach a larger audience, which is a benefit to you and the host, but it also just shows that you value them reaching out to you and you value their collaboration. And these kind of things have a way of coming back around. So I hope these tips have been helpful. And again, you don't have to be perfect, but if you keep these things in mind, the podcast host will thank you, and you're both going to be getting more out of the process. And let me know in the comments section below, is there anything else that you do to prepare for podcast interviews that could be helpful for other podcasters? And as always, if this video has been helpful, hit that like button and subscribe for more podcasting tips and tutorials. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.